Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association and Chair of APA's New Urbanism Division, and I'm your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, August 2nd. We will be hearing the presentation Incorporating Market and Fiscal Analysis in Land Use Planning. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen. For your content questions related to the presentation, you can again type those in the questions chat box located in the webinar toolbar. We will answer your questions at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. Coming up on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2019. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to their members. Today's webcast in particular is sponsored by the Virginia chapter of APA. So thanks to you for coordinating today's session. Coming up on your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts. You can learn about all of our upcoming webcasts and register for them by visiting our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. This session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. To log those CM credits, head over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and then you can search either by today's title or event number, both of which can be found again on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And we do have some sessions that are recorded and available for on-demand distance education. We have 1.5 ethics and 1.5 law. To learn more about those and to get a link to view them, again, just head over to our webcast webpage and all that information is there. Let's be friends. Like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series. To get up-to-date information on our sessions, any quick releases or last-moment cancellations, that's the place you're going to find them. And hey, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have over 2,000 subscribers right now, over 300 videos for you to watch. So head over there and click the subscribe button to make sure that you stay up to date, and you can join us each time we release a new session. Which brings me to, we are recording today's session, and it will be available on our YouTube channel at the conclusion of today. And we also will have a PDF of the PowerPoint presentation available again at the conclusion on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. All right, I am finished now with my housekeeping items, and I am going to turn it over to today's presenters. Parson, you're up, and I am turning the screen over to you to begin your introduction.
Okay.
Perfect.
You see my screen?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carson Bice from Tischler Bice, and I'm joined by Julie Herlands, also of Tischler Bice. Our firm, if you're not familiar with us, specializes in fiscal and economic impact analysis, as well as infrastructure financing and impact fees. We've done more of that work than anybody in the country. We also do quite a bit of market analysis and real estate feasibility analysis as well. I've been doing this type of work for 28 years now, and Julie can tell you a little bit about her experience.
Sure. Yeah, I've been doing this work for almost 20 years. Prior to that, I was a public sector planner for Fairfax County, Virginia. I am currently a Virginia chapter member. We're based in the DC area, but do work nationally. But do a lot of work in Virginia and East Coast, as well as fast-growing mountain states. And we have some examples as we go through the presentation of those places.
Yeah, I thought we'd start off talking a little bit about the differences between fiscal and economic impact analysis, and then talk a little bit about the fiscal equation, what drives the results for different land uses, and then go to some case studies from around the country. But The first slide here, I think that the first bullet point is one of the most telling, and that is, most of the local governments that we work with across the country really don't know the true cost of development decisions, particularly whether their current land use plan is fiscally sustainable. Many land use plans and many state planning acts require the comprehensive plan to have some sort of capital facilities or public facilities element to that, but that's really missing the bigger picture, because for most local governments, the capital cost or the capital budget is usually only 15 to 25% of the total expenditures for a given year. And so it's really the operating costs that are the costs that really drive whether new growth is fiscally sustainable or not. So relative to that point, it really begs the question: how do you know if you can implement your land use plan if you haven't done that type of fiscal sustainability analysis? So it really answers the question for the local constituency of, has or is growth really paying for itself? Another thing we're seeing with many communities, believe it or not, 8 years removed from the Great Recession, is that still many communities are feeling a slight hangover from that time. And as of the last National League of Cities publication on the fiscal states of jurisdictions across the country, as of 2018, in most communities, property tax revenue hadn't caught up to pre-recession levels yet, and that's the longest hangover we've had from a recession. I think the previous, or the average is about 3 years after the recession, you're back up to those levels. And so what that really means is that many communities are facing increased funding responsibilities due to decreasing state and federal funding, as well as their own internal revenue structure differences, and how can localities make up these differences. Another observation is that most comprehensive plans also don't have a market component to it. And when I was in the public sector, I was fortunate to work for Chesterfield County, Virginia, and there was a market component to all of our different area plans, which really grounded it in market reality. In comparison, though, we didn't do any fiscal analysis, so we fell into that first category of really not knowing whether the plan was implementable or not. And so another observation we're seeing is, should certain development types be incentivized or subsidized, and if so, what types? And this is where fiscal and market analysis really come into play. And I think as we go through the examples here throughout this presentation, that'll become illuminated. When we talk about fiscal analysis, the way we describe it or define it is it's really the cash flow to the public sector. And this graphic here sort of shows you the output, or excuse me, the inputs and the different components. One is you have the land use database or the scenario that you're analyzing, whether that's a citywide, countywide, an area plan, or if it's a specific development project. Levels of service and other factors are defined through demographics and tax base analysis. We're looking at the operating costs, the capital facility costs, and then we look at what the revenue is, and then we see whether the results are positive or negative. When we look at the economic impact equation, it's slightly different. We're looking at the cash flow to the private sector. And so when we look at economic impact analysis, we're looking at, well, what is the direct consumer and business spending, which is the ongoing impact. We're looking at the one-time impacts, which include construction jobs and construction spending. Then there's the spin-off, or what's also known as the indirect or induced employment and spending. And it's important to note that these economic impacts do not follow jurisdictional lines. Many of the impacts can be regional in nature, depending on the size of the project. They can be statewide in nature. And the reason why I think it's important that we compare and contrast economic and fiscal impacts is that, Julie and I spend a lot of time in front of public bodies across the country, and in many cases we see folks passing off economic impact analysis as fiscal impact and vice versa. And a lot of time elected officials really don't appreciate the differences. And they're both important, but from an economic perspective, it really doesn't matter what the incomes associated with certain jobs are. from a fiscal perspective unless you have income tax by place of employment within your community. Now, it is important from an economic perspective, and I think you'll see as we go through here, when we start talking about the elements of the fiscal equation or the drivers of the fiscal equation, why these different economic components may or may not be important. This is an example of sort of the output you get from an economic impact analysis. You can see here, there's a table to show the direct and indirect and induced effect jobs, the labor, the income, and then your long-term economic impact. And we're often asked, this is an important clarifier here, we're often asked by clients and others, is what's the difference between what you do with fiscal impact analysis? How is that different than what our budget or finance folks do on a day-to-day basis? And there's two real elements here that are quite different. One is municipal budgeting is primarily a revenue-driven operation or exercise. So your finance or budget folks are either referring to state distribution formulas for certain revenue sources, and others they're looking at trends. So they're looking at what a past increase has been, and then they project that going forward. And once they've gotten their revenue forecast, they then back into what they can afford. So it's a fiscally constrained operation. Fiscal impact analysis is just the opposite of that. It is not revenue constrained. We are looking at what is the forecast of operating and capital expenses needed to maintain current levels of service. And maintaining current levels of service is a huge assumption because most localities across the country are not maintaining current levels of service across the board. They're walking a budgetary tightrope on a year-to-year basis, and they increase levels of service in one area, but they decrease in the other, like for instance, putting off roof replacements or delaying the opening of new schools or new facilities in order to maintain that balanced budget. So we look at what does it cost and then see if the revenue is enough. And if the revenue is not enough, then you need to find ways to ameliorate those deficits, or you're going to have to accept lower levels of service going forward. So when we look at fiscal analysis, we look at the kind of questions that can be answered are numerous. A common one is what is the impact of different land use or economic development policies, as well as what is the impact of land use policies and development patterns. So what is the relationship between development densities and the provision of infrastructure? What's the optimal mix of land uses? What's the relationship between the geographic location of new development and the relative cost? You can also use fiscal analysis for evaluating the leveraging of public dollars for economic growth, also known as incentives or subsidies. So in other words, you're looking at how to invest limited funds to maximize return. You can do that in a redevelopment situation as well as for tax increment financing. The timing of impacts, this is a huge question many of our clients ask us is, are we living off tomorrow's growth? Meaning that because we've kept our tax rate artificially low, because we haven't raised it in 10 years, let's say, are we solely dependent on new growth in order to improve our increment, so to speak, growth-related revenue? And then how do you measure the impacts of annexation? Measuring the revenue is always the easy part of annexations. The hard part is developing the plan for services that are required by many state enabling statutes for annexation, which basically says that you have to provide a plan for extending specific levels of service that the city currently provides into these newly annexed areas. And then we're also seeing a trend toward using fiscal analysis to measure the impacts of demographic and economic changes. For instance, what happens if our population ages in place, or there's sort of a high mobility or a changeover or recycling? What's the impact of Generation X on home buying trends? What's the impact of millennials deferring home buying? Also, the impact of behavioral trends is quite common now embedded within the analysis. For instance, new patterns in retail consumption. This is particularly important in many Western states where the cities rely heavily on sales tax as their primary growth-related revenue. Also, affecting the demand for transportation-related infrastructure in different ways is this movement away from the automobile and an emphasis on walkable urbanism. And there's an interesting table here from an analysis we did in the Reno area for the Regional Transportation Commission, where it looked at by service area, what the vehicles available were by housing unit, what the household sizes were, what the mode shares were, the average VMT. And so you can see here fairly easily that you can craft the inputs into a scenario, into different geographies that show these differences in behavior, which influences the fiscal outcomes. Let's talk a little bit about methodologies. We don't want to bore you to tears with the methodology, but I think it is important that we touch on this a little bit. By far, the two common most methodologies are what we call case study marginal approach, as well as average cost. Average cost is by far the most popular. We tend to focus on case study marginal in our analysis. We think it's more reflective of fiscal reality. It's dependent on local levels of service, and really the differences here are that the average cost focuses on simplistic per capita and employee measurements. It doesn't consider available capacity of infrastructure like the case study marginal approach does. And I'll show you an example of that here in a second. It also masks the timing of expenditures. It doesn't reflect geographic differences very well. It uses these average or current costs, and that's a huge consideration because sometimes the cost to provide infrastructure or services in the future can be very different than how infrastructure or services are provided today. My favorite example of that is related to parks and recreation. In the past, parks departments have focused on sort of the traditional neighborhood and community and regional parks. Now the focus is much more on large special purpose facilities, athletic complexes, spray parks, etc. And those can have a very different operating impact than those traditional neighborhood and community parks. And so an average cost approach really doesn't do a good job of addressing what those impacts are. Also, it takes a budget in equilibrium, and what I mean by that is local governments are required to balance their budget. And so in simplistic terms, you're dividing the cost side by population or population and employment. Then you're dividing the revenue side by population or population and employment, with the exception of property tax. And by definition, new development tends to have a higher assessed value than existing development. And so in property tax related states, that's why you see many of these average cost studies show that growth pays for itself in most cases. And the case study marginal approach is much more sensitive to the differences between communities. Again, the available capacity within your infrastructure system triggers those large lumpy operating costs that we see here in this graph of the annual net fiscal impacts. If this would have been an average cost approach, we would have just seen a trend line, a straight trend line going from positive or fiscally neutral in year one to the deficits shown in year 30. It would just been sort of a gradual trend down. But with the marginal cost approach, you can see those differences based on the opening of facilities and the absorption of these large operating costs. Three other methods that I think are worth mentioning are proportional valuation. We don't see this very often. And it's very simplistic. It basically says that if your tax base is 70% residential versus 30% non-residential, that's also the cost generation. And so there's really no evaluation of levels of service, no apportionment of costs to different land use types, etc. Comparable city relies on the U.S. Census of Governments data, which tends to be regional in nature. It's usually 2 or 3 years dated, so it's really not very accurate. And then finally, we have the cost of community services study, which was developed by the American Farmland Trust. It's typically weighted to show that agricultural uses perform well fiscally, and so it's somewhat of a biased methodology, but it's very popular around the country and worth mentioning. So I said I was going to mention or show you a comparison between marginal and average costing, and this is 2 models from the exact same jurisdiction. One is this from Hillsborough County, Florida, and the bottom is an average cost model that was developed by the state. And you can see here in red that this is the Parks and Recreation budget, and it's basically divided by population to get a a cost of $18.36. Well, in Hillsborough County, Florida, which is the home of Tampa, as you can imagine, it's a very large county. The Parks Department is very complex. It's composed of probably 8 or 9 different divisions. I can't remember off the top of my head, but we developed a model for the independent Hillsborough City County Planning Commission that looked at Hillsborough County, and this is just the staffing input for one division. And so, as you can imagine, if you've got 8 divisions, you've got not only the non-salary operating budget, but you've also got the personnel. And with a marginal cost, you project both separately. And you also have fixed costs, which most average cost analyses don't consider. And so certain administrative or overhead type positions a lot of times aren't really growing relative to new growth, where other positions are. And in this case, conversations with staff said equipment operators would increase with population in the unincorporated county, and there's an estimate of available capacity. Multi-trade workers will increase with additional recreation square feet. And so as the model is building additional recreation space, it's monitoring whether it needs to hire new workers. Same with park manager and park ranger. That's triggered by additional park construction. And so you can see the differences here between sort of the complexity of the marginal cost versus the average cost relative to parks. This shows the same type of comparison only for schools, and we're showing capital here. And again, the same 2 models, and the average cost model basically says that the capital cost per student is $388. Well, our model is looking at, well, where are the attendance zones and what's the capacity within, or what's the available capacity within each of these attendance areas. And so the model fills up student seats, and then once you get to a stated threshold, I believe in this model is 110% utilization, the model then built entire elementary schools, entire high schools, entire middle schools, et cetera. And so it's very, very refined. It's not as easy as saying, or as simple as saying that each new student costs you $388. It's very, very misleading. Next, we want to talk about some common misconceptions that we run into around the country. And one of them are sort of these blanket statements, which we think are quite dangerous, which is just to simply say, residential development doesn't pay for itself, or non-residential development always generates surpluses. And you'll see through this next discussion that it's not that simple. There are several different factors that drive the fiscal equation. The most important is the revenue structure. And what we mean by that is, what are your primary growth-related sources of revenue? And more importantly, what are their distribution formulas? Again, we're going to show you an example of that. But that means, are you primarily a property tax jurisdiction? Do you get property tax and sales tax? Do you get franchise fees, income tax, et cetera? What are the demographic and socioeconomic characteristics of new development? Person per household, pupil generation rates, some of those other behavioral factors that we showed you earlier, like utilization of mode share, where you live geographically, influences some of your travel behavior, et cetera. What's the infrastructure capacity or life cycle of your city? Are you a newly developing greenfield suburb, or are you an older redeveloping city? That influences the equation. And then finally, what are the levels of service that you provide within the community as a whole? So the first example we want to show you is how the revenue structure drives the fiscal impacts. And so in Arizona, and this is from the city of Scottsdale, most cities, their primary source of revenue is point of sale sales tax, meaning that if the sales happen within the city, the revenue stays within the city. And so, as you can imagine, retail is generating substantial surpluses on a per 1,000 square foot basis because of that revenue generated, whereas office generates modest surplus, and industrial is almost fiscally neutral, so to speak. But if we take those same basic uses and locate those within Ohio, we get a completely different fiscal picture. And that's because for cities in Ohio, the primary source of revenue is local income tax, and it's by place of employment, where, for instance, in Maryland, where I live, the jurisdictions get income tax but it's by place of residence, okay? But you see here that retail, which typically have lower wage employment, is generating deficits on a per 1,000 square foot basis, primarily because of the transportation and public safety costs and the relative lack of revenue. And then office and industrial, with the higher wage employment, are generating the big net surpluses in Ohio. And so, again, this just sort of shows the influence of the revenue structure. This is, I think, is a great slide from a study we did, I think it was in 2000 in Sarasota County. But even though it's almost 20 years, it has great relevance. And this is one of the first studies we were involved in where we were able to get geocoded pupil generation rate or pupil data from school districts. And so this just shows how you can't make a blanket statement about single family residential land uses within one community. We have 3 single family subdivisions that were used as prototypes. Bel Air Estates generated surpluses, and that's because one, it had high dollar or high assessed value, empty nester type McMansions. But the big cost driver here, or the big reason for the surpluses, is there were no public school children generated out of this subdivision, whereas Greenfield and Summerwood were entry level and more mid-level residential subdivisions. And again, the assessed values aren't as high as Bel Air Estates, but they're also generating large amounts of public school children. And so this is a great example of how demographic characteristics influence the fiscal equation as well. You can talk about this one, Julie.
Okay. And then it goes into the research. Yeah, so the other, the sort of drilling down on residential characteristics in the blanket statement of all residential not paying for itself. One of, as better and more refined data becomes available, we can look to characteristics from multifamily units in a way that provides some good and sound fiscal analysis. And so in this case, in this community, this is a description or illustration of student generation rates, which then drives this locality's major cost center, which is schools. And so the question for them is, as they start to densify and provide more mixed use developments with multifamily units, what does that mean in terms of the demand on their school, on their existing and expansion to their schools? And so what we can do is really drill down into units and size of units and show and illustrate that that unit type, size of units, down to bedroom plus a den, 2 bedrooms plus a den, 3 bedrooms and on up. Not only by the size of unit, but also the ownership style contributes tremendously to the demand for school operating costs and capital costs as well. Yeah, next slide. And so then thinking about changes and connections between the drivers of the fiscal equation, how that relates to land use. So one of the things we're also seeing in terms of retail is, and you see it day to day, is this really significant change in the type of retail and the revenue, and by extension of that, the revenue generation potential for different types of retail. So this is an example from a community in Colorado, which is sales tax based. And they derive the majority of their funding for their services, for their budget from point of sale sales tax. And so what the question here was, well, as we have different, within this community, we have different types of retail. What does that mean to the city, to the city's bottom line? And so these different characteristics emerge with real data, with actual prototypes, with actual uses underneath those types of retail. So a community retail that's generating significant amount of retail, enough to cover the expenditures that are being generated from that establishment. And you'll see the cost shown there, about $230 of taxable sales per square foot. But then thinking about those smaller scale neighborhood retail centers that were being increasingly occupied by non-sales tax producing land uses, churches, fitness centers, those kinds of things. So in this case, with these examples, this neighborhood retail in a point of sale sales tax environment was not covering the costs it was generating. And as we start to think about the changing face of retail, sort of a little bit of a tangent, but thinking about the impact of online sales and where the growth in retail sales is occurring. And this is kind of a combination of, and we talk about this, thinking about sort of traditional goods, shopper goods type retail, and as well as restaurants and other sort of entertainment uses, which are flourishing in a lot of places. But there is, as we all, I always kind of bring it back to my own behavior of increasingly, not frequenting stores and purchasing more goods online. So this, what's showing here is a rapid increase in growth of total retail sales from e-commerce, from internet sales, that portion, and it's been almost about a percentage per year. And that's really the share of the growth in retail sales is made up from growth in e-commerce and internet sales. It's about 20% growth since the recession. And what this means in terms of the fiscal equation is that the majority of those types of goods that are shifting from bricks and mortar retail to online are those that are housed in retail establishments. So you see here this blue line of sporting goods, hobby goods, those kinds of things that can be purchased online readily, where those sales tax revenue gets shifted through away from point of sale sales tax into internet sales. However, that said, there are some recent trends occurring that we see and that will affect revenue generation and retail land uses. And this is sort of changing by the minute. This is a fast-paced changing trends. While mall closures are up over the last year or so, and we've still been, the United States is still considered over-retailed compared to an international basis, but still sort of an excess capacity of retail space. Malls are now sort of converting to non-retail tenants for a few purposes, one of which is to draw consumers to the space, the existing space and the uses, to then hopefully increase sales and retain the tenants. However, those spaces are now being occupied by non-sales tax paying uses. So overall, the sales tax generation for malls on the whole is decreasing. There are some additional positive signs for bricks and mortar retail, and you'll see here there's some links here. If you get this presentation afterwards, you can click through to the sources that many internet companies, primarily that started as internet companies, have been building and moving into bricks and mortar spaces, but with smaller footprints than their predecessors. So it's really as more of a showroom, as a way to test out a product and then purchase online, again, with implications for sales tax generation as communities go forward. And then finally, this is the one that's fascinating to me, I think the most, is the emerging of a renter consumer. So this is not only with Airbnb, but this is transitioning to clothing. So lots of rent the runway kind of things, but also now there's a movement afoot for home goods as well. So my question there again is, what does that happen to? How does that affect sales tax generation for localities that are, particularly those localities, dependent on sales tax to fund their services? So then, going back to thinking about drivers of the fiscal equation, this is meant to show the sort of wide range of levels of service and services provided that can influence the bottom line for a fiscal impact analysis and for analysis of locality services. So this is an example of an analysis we did in Bexar County, Texas, looking at some localities, some small cities, relatively small cities, municipalities within the county, and the wide ranges of services that they provided, what they did provide, what they didn't provide, and then what that sort of looked like from a cost perspective. And so it's really meant to illustrate, again, this sort of wide range, thinking about what revenue your local source revenues are paying for, and how that can vary, and how it's important to understand it and as looking at those analyses, but also then to be able to communicate when you're talking about fiscal impacts of growth and that part of the equation about what is provided and what's not provided in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, and one thing to add on this, I mean, a great example of this, I learned early on in my career. One of the first analyses I did was in Carroll County, Maryland, which is a county in between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. And I think at that point in 1996 or so, it had about, I don't know, 175,000 people. But its public safety budget was about $4 million. And the reason for that was they had a contract with the state troopers called the Resident Trooper Program. And so if you were a state trooper and lived in Carroll County, they paid a nominal fee, and basically that was their law enforcement. And if you're familiar with most counties of that size, your public safety law enforcement budget would probably be approaching $25 or $30 million. And so, only having a level of service of $400 or $4 million can have a big effect on the cost side of the fiscal equation. And the last part of the equation we want to talk about is it's somewhat related, or one is what's your infrastructure capacity, and that's related to the life cycle of the city. And we'll show you a few examples here. This is it's Champaign, Illinois, from about 10 years ago, and we looked at two scenarios: what happens if you encourage growth within the service area, and then the second is growth beyond the service area, which is more of a scattershot development pattern. But there's a huge $50 million infrastructure extension difference due to keeping growth constrained within the existing infrastructure footprint. And so the results are much more positive from a fiscal perspective. And before Julie tells you about Shreveport on this slide, another great example I like to talk about relative to this is we did two studies in Kansas at the same time. One was Lenexa and the other in Lawrence. And in Lawrence, growth didn't pay for itself, and in Lenexa it did. And you've got two communities 50 miles apart, exact same revenue structures. And the reason is Lawrence was growing on the fringes. They were constantly having to extend the infrastructure footprint, whereas Lenexa was approaching build out, had extended much of their infrastructure footprint in the past. And so the cost complexion was very different in those two communities. And again, it had to do with where you were in the life cycle.
Right, and to close out the infrastructure element component of the equation, one thing you think about not only the actual capacity, but the useful capacity of a system and infrastructure components. And so in this case, this was a part of a comprehensive plan effort, and thinking about solving for the capital needs that would emerge if growth occurred in a certain way. And at the same time, there's not only needs to accommodate growth, but also existing needs that were identified as unfunded currently. And so those unfunded needs were a reflection of this usable capacity or the ability to get to capacity that could be used to then serve both existing and new development. And so part of this effort was then to say, well, what do you have currently that can help to pay for these needs from revenue source potential? And then the next step after this was then an analysis of an investigation of, well, okay, what other tools are available to you as a community, such as impact fees or special assessment districts, or dedicating an additional property tax millage to capital needs to solve for that shortfall.
So now we're going to conclude the presentation with some case studies from around the country. and the first few are ones that Julie was involved in.
Yep. So we talk about how fiscal analysis can be used and is used, fiscal market analysis can be used in comprehensive plans. So this is an example a few years ago from the town of Queen Creek. It's a community that's located between Phoenix and Tucson. When we originally began doing work for them in about 2003, about over 15 years ago, the town had a population of about 5,000 people, and population today is around 40,000. So quite fast-growing community with infrastructure and service needs throughout their history. So this was a small area plan. Actually, they call it a specific area plan in the community of a targeted area with a request or an interest in shifting from employment land uses, so non-residential land uses, to residential, and particularly to medium and high density residential, along with some retail as well. And this is a an Arizona community, which is heavily, which is funded most exclusively by sales tax, of which I think their property tax today is really only targeted specifically for fire services. And so part of this analysis was looking at capacity of the land. So alternative scenarios were developed not only based on the capacity and the acres available, but also on market assumptions and absorption relative to recent market demand.
You know, another important component, or one of the catalysts for this study, was again what we talked about in the beginning, where the plan was done without any real understanding of their position in the market, and many folks in the community thought that they should set aside huge swaths of commercial land in the hopes of landing, you know, the retail white whale, so to speak, of Lowe's or Best Buys, not understanding that their position elsewhere in the market was elsewhere relative to shoppers' goods.
Right, and so in looking at these two different land use scenarios, the existing plan with more non-residential land uses versus the future plan with some amount of non-residential land uses, but also more residential land uses or higher density residential land uses. This is the bottom line fiscal impact results from the analysis, and this is revenues minus expenditures. And so anything above that zero line is a positive, anything below is a negative. And you'll see here that the future plan, the changed plan, generates fiscal surpluses, generates surpluses over the time period. And there is also, we should note too, there's retail assumed, as well as sales tax generated from residential development. And so thinking about and looking at sort of the bottom line and what's important to communicate out to the community, that while the existing plan, both of these plans are essentially fiscally neutral. So the existing plan, again, assuming a market absorption of land uses allowed through that plan, generates about, this is sort of breaks even, $1 in revenue for $1 in costs. While the future plan generates significantly more revenue and more expenses. It generates sufficient revenue to cover the expenditures at a higher return rate, higher percentage coverage, but is still essentially fiscally neutral, fiscally positive. And this was articulated, communicated to the community, to the elected officials, and the plan ultimately approved by town council. So then the next example I want to talk about is utilizing a market assessment and approach, and leading that into a fiscal assessment. And so this is a county in Virginia, Isle of Wight County. They've had a relatively small county, steady population growth at slightly over 1% over the last few years. Even through the recession, to a certain extent, they've sort of been relatively steady. On the employment front, however, the recession did affect this community. They've had relatively stable growth recent years, but they have not yet, and Carson mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation, have not reached their pre-recession levels of 2008. And this is really a bedroom community. It's a rural community, a bedroom community with some incorporated areas with some manufacturing, some food production, those kinds of things. But they did take a hit during the recession. So they're embarking on their update to their comprehensive plan. We've worked with them over many years on capital impacts, looking at their capital infrastructure needs and costing those out for them over the years. And they're now updating their comprehensive plan and incorporating this fiscal element into the plan. So the question then is well, in terms of their current land use plan, and the demand for different types of housing units and different non-residential, a similar kind of a endeavor with significant non-residential land use set aside with an interest, again, as a bedroom community, interest in converting those uses to residential. So we have again, continuation of steady population growth anticipated in the region, and then thinking about as they're working toward that population projection, which is that gray dotted dashed line, what amount of land is needed to accommodate that population growth? So we're testing the current land use plan versus two different alternative scenarios, with not much difference between the two alternative scenarios, but a little bit of a difference between the current land use and the alternative scenarios. And so the question again is, we have this demand for residential development. Our population will continue to grow, providing we have the housing to accommodate. What does that mean in terms of additional capacity for our land use plan? So then on the employment, on the non-residential side, same kind of approach, looking at, again, sort of steady growth within the region, no real anticipated shocks or interventions here in this community, that there would be continued non-residential growth. And thinking about what is set aside in the current land use plan, an oversupply of land use available to accommodate potential projection to potential employment growth through 2040. And so making those adjustments in the alternative scenarios 1 and 2, with a decrease in that employment capacity, the land that's available to accommodate that employment, there's sufficient capacity here to shift that land from non-residential to residential. So the scenarios then were slightly tweaked in terms of the types of land uses. I should also mention too that there's non-residential land uses that are modeled as well. So it's a combination of residential land uses and non-residential land uses as well. And the bottom line, you can hit the next one too. The bottom line is that each of these scenarios, both current land use plan and the alternatives off of the current land use plan, all generate fiscally neutral or fiscally positive results. That even though revenues and expenditures actually are less in the alternative scenarios than the current land use plan, the alternative does generate additional revenue, a higher amount of revenue than the other alternatives. And just the bottom line that they're, again, all showing positive fiscal impacts.
I want to talk a little bit about an analysis we did, really forward-thinking county about 20 years ago, Howard County, Maryland, who's won several awards for comprehensive plans, and they've always incorporated fiscal analysis into their planning process. But once we were done in 2000 with the analysis of the land use plan, excuse me, they wanted to do a phase 2 that looked at, well, what happens if we age in place versus having a continued regular turnover of our housing supply, and what does that mean to us fiscally, as well as overlaying an infrastructure replacement component to this. And for those of you who were around in at the turn of the century, there was a lot of talk in local government about the impact of GASB 34, and which is an accounting term, about how jurisdictions were going to have to account for infrastructure on their books. And so we looked at these two scenarios, and we brainstormed with county staff about, well, what does this mean in terms of, if we age in place over time, obviously it has an impact on our school system because we're not recycling homes. But what does it really mean for our human services and cultural and parks and recreation programs? And so we brainstormed how those services would look differently. And as you can see here, the net surpluses, net deficits, and the deficits were primarily incurred because of the infrastructure replacement program. But under the aging in place was much better alternative, obviously, because in Howard County or in Maryland, the county is responsible for schools, so it's not an independent school district. And so, but again, this is an example of what we talked about earlier about how you can use fiscal impact analysis to look at these changing demographic shifts in our community. The next one I want to talk about quickly is a redevelopment project in Somerville, Massachusetts, which is right across from downtown Boston and right next door to what's the city Harvard's in? Cambridge, yeah. A very dense city, and a lot of exciting things are happening there now. We were the economic consultant on the Union Square neighborhood plan, which has two components. One is called Boynton Yards, the other is Union Square itself. But the reason I think this is germane is, one, there was a market component to this, but also in order to have this happen, a lot of intervention was required by the city in terms of infrastructure. And a lot of you may be familiar with these studies that purport to show that, if you just encourage development downtown, you get these huge revenues per acre and the costs are so low. Well, that's true in a lot of cases, but it's not true in all cases. And I'm going to show you two cases that sort of illustrate that. So this summarizes the infrastructure costs. You got 18.8 million in road and streetscape upgrades. You've got utility upgrades. It was assumed that certain things or certain infrastructure categories were constructed by the developer. Same for Union Square, significant costs for utility upgrades, streetscapes, as well as fire stations. But the good news is because the amount of development that was going to happen and the percentage that was going to be non-residential in nature, and the fact that there was so much residential density associated with this, that we generated or showed positive results and for both of these neighborhoods. Now, the capital side did generate deficits, but the good news was that the operating component or the operating results were enough to offset those, and so surplus were generated cumulatively over the 20 years. But then when you look at it from an annual perspective, and this is the importance of marginal costing, is you can see that even though this is a positive for the city over a 20-year period, there are going to be deficits incurred in the initial years, particularly for Union Square. It's about 8 years, I think, before you start to get a positive return on investment. Well, armed with this kind of information, you can, locality can go to the negotiating table and hammer out a development agreement that can make yourself whole over the short term through public benefits or other types of payments to cover these types of deficits. And finally, I want to show you sort of the opposite, which is the downtown Las Vegas master plan, where we were the economic consultant there. And this had a huge market component to it that we were responsible for. And the situation that we found ourselves in when we started this plan was that the lack of existing investment implied the need that the city was going to have to incentivize growth in the future. When we started this, it was right after, you may be familiar with the downtown project, which was funded by Tony Hsieh at Zappos. When they moved Zappos from Henderson into the old Clark County, the old City Hall, he started a private investment within the downtown, and it had some positive effects, but it also had some negative side effects relative to what the city was trying to do elsewhere downtown. Because of the investment there, it had inflated or artificially inflated land values in other parts of downtown. You had affordability issues, huge vacancy rate. There were 3,000 or 300% more than that of Clark County. You had interesting land assemblage issues. And an interesting point was the city had a policy of not using eminent domain, which can be very difficult if you're trying to redevelop downtown and assemble properties. Other things that were hurdles were if the city participated with any sort of incentives, you had prevailing wage requirements that could price certain projects out of the market. You'd only had 375 housing starts since 2008. There were huge issues relative to safety, and it was expensive relative to competing product. It was more costly to rent downtown than it was in Summerlin, which some would argue was really the downtown for many residents of Las Vegas in the suburban town center. And so it was much cheaper and safer to be in Summerlin. And so as part of this analysis, we looked at different market futures, meaning conservative, if you did nothing, which met current market demand. There was moderate intervention versus aggressive intervention versus super aggressive. And so the stakeholder involvement effort selected the super aggressive scenario, which projected a need for about 6.8 million square feet of additional housing, significant retail, hotel and gaming, office, institutional, and industrial development. Well, the interesting thing is you've got to prime the pump, so to speak, to have that sort of intervention happen, because otherwise you can just expect the status quo. And so all of that intervention had a cost, okay? But in addition to that intervention, there were other components of the plan that came to light, and that is, in order to make downtown attractive, there was significant infrastructure investment that was going to have to be made. And this graphic just shows sort of the relative magnitude of what was going to be needed in terms of trails, tree canopy, open spaces, et cetera, which all had a public cost. But from a market perspective, we were recommending, one, that you implement an aggressive downtown housing strategy. You're going to have to offer significant housing incentives, whether it was down payment assistance, buying down the cost of land in order to prime the pump in the short term, a more aggressive intervention on the city in terms of assembling property, establishing a local entrepreneurship program. And also an interesting idea that came out of this was establish an economic development capital fund, which would be very much like a mutual fund where companies or individuals within the area could invest, and then based on a set of criteria, this capital fund would invest in projects within downtown. And really the point here is that in order to have your alternative future happen, you need to be aware of the market, and you also have to look at what is the cost of that intervention, not only excuse me, in terms of any infrastructure, but what are the costs of these other intervention strategies, whether they're programs, creation of departments within a city to handle redevelopment, et cetera. And so again, it goes to that discussion about, it's just not as simple as saying, if you just encourage density downtown, all these positive things are going to happen from a fiscal perspective. And that's not to say that it's not worth incurring deficits in the short term in order for positive results in the long term. But before we wrap up, what I hope you took away from this presentation was that in certain ways, fiscal impact analysis is somewhat of an art and a science. There's all these methodologies available. There's a lot of leeway given the individual analyst in terms of coming up with assumptions and levels of service, definitions, et cetera, all of which influence the fiscal result. And it's not uncommon to see a developer submit a fiscal study that says this project is positive, and the locality have a fiscal analysis prepared that shows the opposite, right? It's not like stormwater engineering where you can, the way you calculate stormwater runoff is the same. You just plug in the numbers into the equation. Fiscal impact analysis isn't like that. It's important to understand the market when you're developing land use plans. It's also important, if a market analysis is not being prepared, that you run alternative scenarios that may vary absorption, may vary mix of uses, particularly if these non-residential uses are huge influencers on your fiscal results. For instance, the sales tax situation out west, the amount of retail really drives the results. You can't rely on one size fits all approaches. Each jurisdiction is unique in terms of what their priorities are in terms of infrastructure and services. And the important thing is that we're not advocating fiscal zoning at all. Fiscal and economic and market analysis are just one part of the equation when you're evaluating a land use plan or an area plan or a specific development project. As we all know, you have to consider transportation, equity, affordable housing, environmental considerations, etc. The real goal, of doing this type of work is the goal is to educate your citizenry as well as the elected officials and planning commissioners so they have the best data available to make these important land use decisions. And I think we're now ready for questions.
All right, thank you. So everyone, if you have questions, just type them into the chat box function. We don't have any yet. I'm sure they're going to come in. And just as a reminder, we are recording this webcast session and it will be available on our YouTube channel. You just have to search Planning Webcast on YouTube. We'll also have a PDF of the presentation available on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Okay, and this was great. I love the case studies. I think it's really helpful. We do have some questions rolling in now, so let's go ahead and take to some of these. Hi, Nancy. Have you had opportunity to evaluate the outcome of some of your studies kind of against reality?
So that is the most asked question. But I'm going to turn it over to Julie here in a second. But the difficulty with that is that you do this analysis at a point in time, right? And it's much harder to measure those results if you're doing a city or a county-wide type of analysis. It's somewhat easier with a specific development project, and that's what Julie's going to tell you about here in a second. But the thing to keep in mind is that, again, it's that snapshot of time. So you were making an assumption about levels of service. You're making assumptions about tax rates and other revenue sources. And in reality, politics got involved on a year-to-year basis. And so if you look 10 years out, it's very difficult to do an apples-to-apples comparison because decisions were made to reduce expenditures here in order to increase them there. Because most places, aren't raising their sales and property tax rates. It's as simple as that. I mean, if you treated the general fund like an enterprise fund, we'd be out of a job. But Julie has a history in Falls Church, Virginia, of developing a model, and she's going to share with you their experience. And they went back and looked at the actual revenue generation from projects that occurred versus what the model projected.
As well as, thank you, as well as the demand off of that development. And so you recall on the slide we had on the student generation rate piece that they're very vigilant on tracking and updating those rates with real-time information. And so because of that, they've been very close within about 5 to 10% of the registered impact, the predicted versus the projected versus actual impact in terms of students and therefore the costs coming out of those units. And the one difference, and that also speaks to to the information on that slide, is that one of the major developments that occurred was built and marketed was intended to be a condo development that then at the time that it was being built, the condo market kind of fell out, bottomed out, and got transitioned to an apartment, and they were very large units. And that, if you recall that slide, there were three bedroom units that are now rentals that do generate quite a number of school-age children that attend local schools. So that was really the one data point, that the one piece of a project that sort of flipped their results. But on the revenue side, relative, their projections were conservative and came out, and they've come out to the better on the revenue assessments over the years. The one piece of the one caveat there is they do require set aside for retail space on ground floors for these mixed use projects. And those spaces have at first were relatively slow to fill up, so the vacancy rate was a little bit higher than other places in the region, and have been increasingly transitioned to those service type establishments. However, property tax state. Most of the majority of the revenue is derived from property taxes, and so the appreciation of the residential units and the low student generation rates are covering those expenses.
Okay, thank you. Next question. This is interesting. What impacts will climate change have on the fiscal impacts of development and on the fiscal and market analysis of communities?
Interesting question.
Yeah, I stumped you, didn't I?
Yeah, obviously it's something that I think is going to be an emerging theme in fiscal analysis in the future. In fact, when I was at the APA conference in San Francisco, I spoke at great length to several folks on the engineering side that were doing, climate-related, sea level rise related engineering in the Boston area, and they mentioned to me that no one's really, we quantify the cost, but no one's really looking at, well, how are we going to fund it? And so we haven't been asked to do any of that specifically yet. We've gotten involved in a few climate-related, fee studies. Like we just did a vehicle climate fee in Boulder, and similar work elsewhere. But I think it's going to be an emerging piece of this practice, I think.
Yeah, and if I could add too, it's and Carson mentioned the cost. It's this, the costs can and will be quantified in those projects and the types of projects and the public costs will evolve and change as we're dealing with the ramifications, mitigating those impacts. And so it's the same, it's a similar approach in terms of what are the costs to be covered by revenue sources, and then it's that other piece of well, are new and different revenue sources, potential tools that are out there to help to cover those additional costs. But the question and the process and the analysis is essentially same to what we would do for any other other cost that's out there.
It's quite similar to me. Just a transportation master plan, for instance. Everybody spends a lot of money on transportation plans and comes up with the total cost, but most of them really don't figure out how you're going to actually pay for all of it. Same with parks. I mean, most park master plans don't even have a funding component. They just say, hey, everybody wants higher levels of service for parks, but no one really talks about how we're going to pay for it. And so it's very similar. A lot of places are quantifying the cost, but not really putting together the revenue side.
Thank you. Next question. Are you aware of any training resources to gain a more in-depth knowledge about using and implementing these models?
Yeah, you can buy my book on iTunes. Shameless plug. I'm kidding. There's a great thing. Actually, I'm looking for it on my bookshelf. I think it was published by the Urban Land Institute. It's called the Development Impact Handbook. That's very good. Chris Nelson from University of Utah has a great book on like estimating, multipliers. that's very handy for economic impact analysis. Yeah, let's see. It's from the Urban Land Institute. Yeah, the Development Impact Assessment Handbook. I've written a book called Fiscal Impact Methodologies for Planners. There's a book out by, what's the woman's name, who did the spatial?
Right.
I can't remember her name off the top of my head.
She's out of Minnesota.
But yeah, she's out of Minnesota. But if whoever asked the question wants her information, they can email us,
Yep.
and we can forward that information as well. So there's a few resources out there.
We swear, folks that are on the line, that we did not stage that question. And let's see. Could you please explain the PAYGO model?
What do you mean the PAYGO model?
It's,
I mean,
is it maybe a pay-as-you-go model? It's a question that just came in, and I figured you knew what it meant.
Yeah, so I hope we understood the question correctly. But most jurisdictions fund infrastructure one of two ways. Some do a little bit of both. But there's the model where you basically go out and debt finance most of your capital needs, or put down a small down payment. For instance, if you have $30 million impact fee balance, you may use that for the elementary school and then fund the rest through bonds. Then there's the pay-as-you-go model, which basically says that our policy is that we're going to pay cash for infrastructure going forward. Now, I don't know if there's a specific question related to that.
Yeah, and
to the benefits.
Right, and from the impacts, interesting, because that was a couple slides that we removed for the presentation about, changing those assumptions in a fiscal impact analysis will have an effect on the bottom line results, so that if you assume debt financing for capital improvements over a timeline, you're spreading those costs out over a 20-year or more period. And so if you build something in year 10, you're going to show, years 10 through 20, a cost associated with that. And then beyond year 20, those costs continue. And the question then becomes, are the revenues from new growth, are they sufficient? Are the revenues that are continuing on beyond your growth related revenues, are they sufficient to cover those expenditures? And so, and the converse is, if you show a PAYGO actual costs of capital improvements, those lumpy effects, you're going to get those deeper deficits over the time horizon.
Thank you. Okay, next question. This is interesting. How do you consider, when you're doing an analysis, new retail taking sales away from existing retail?
Very good question. Yep. Very good question.
Yeah, right?
Yeah, again, that's the importance of understanding the market and, and understanding, how much sales tax leakage you're getting. And so a lot of times jurisdictions will have that information, or we'll have to estimate it. And another interesting thing is that, we're starting to, in these Western states, before the recession, we tended to estimate retail sales purely on the sales per square foot, but that's disingenuous to think that, for instance, if you live in Castle Rock, Colorado, and you get 10,000 new housing units, but no new retail, that you wouldn't increase your sales tax base. And so what we're able to do now in sort of simple terms is basically figure out, what portion of the discretionary dollars a resident is spending within their community versus elsewhere, and then attributing the remainder to the retail space, which is accounting for, the regional draw, whereas the individual is accounting for the local draw. And so that both land uses are getting credit for that. But whoever asked that question is exactly right, is that, when you're attracting new retail, usually it's cannibalizing from somewhere else in your community.
Right. Yeah, and that does. Great. Yeah, and then just to add on that it again is the not knowledge and investigation of the market, but the art element to the equation as well, to understand what those implications are within that community. And every place is going to be a little bit different, about what that means. And new retail in some places is going to attract more new retail, and other places it's going to cannibalize and take away from the existing. And so it's really, knowing the full picture is paramount.
Okay, next question. With the case study regarding downtown Las Vegas master plan, did the hotel and lodging development and land use affect housing development through land value or other means? And if so, how can this be measured and overcome?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure exactly what they mean by that. Most of the housing demand was coming from basically three sectors. One is the housing associated with Zappos and the ancillary activity there. The other was you were starting to get folks, empty nesters, starting to find the arts district attractive because you've got not only the Symphony Park, you've got art centers there, you've also got the Cleveland Clinic, which is an opportunity to capture medical tourism from Canada. And one of the things that happened at sort of the end of the process was it was announced that UNLV was going to start a medical school. And, and our recommendation was, the city should do everything they can to get that within downtown. And it actually located, I believe, just right outside the corridor, close enough to actually have a very positive effect, because one, you're going to get a certain part of that medical community that's going to want to live downtown, particularly the empty nest faculty, but also if you're an intern there, you really need a 24-hour environment, and Vegas certainly provides that. And so I'm not sure what you mean by the hotel related development that was happening downtown, because there wasn't much happening at the time. You had the old strip there. You had one or two of these Hampton Inn type things happening around, but that was about it.
Okay, well, if they, Jacob, if you need any clarification, just type in or just go ahead and email Carson and Julie. Great. All right, next. We always have this type of question come up. Do you have any resources or materials for how to conduct this level of analysis for small communities with very limited budgets?
Yeah. So, everything that we focused on tended to be sort of scenario related for the most part, and more marginal cost related. There are more simplistic, what we call cost of land use studies, which we recommend for smaller jurisdictions that are learning to crawl before they walk, and they really take a snapshot of time and give you an understanding of what your current land use mix, how it performs fiscally. So essentially, it's allocating your current budget to various land use types to get an idea that on average, retail does this, or on average, single family housing does this. But as you can see from the analysis, there are a lot of factors that go in that are involved, and obviously, if you're a larger city, the geographic location can have a huge difference or a huge impact on how you perform fiscally. But it's really an exercise in sort of a baby steps fiscal analysis.
Okay, thank you. Next question. So it sounds like it's best to do an analysis both before the comprehensive future land use planning, and then later on in the same process to refine the maps and plans after they are drafted. Would you say that's about right? Do you have any caveats to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's part and parcel of most of what the planning related analyses we do on these teams, is that you'll look at these different scenarios, and a lot of times it's refined into this preferred development scenario, and I think that's what the question really related to.
Yeah, the ideal process is to do just that, test the alternatives from a fiscal standpoint, along with other elements that are happening as part of the comprehensive plan. But this is again one component, one component of many many components, and then kind of thinking about part of the ideal process is identifying what those questions are from a land use and fiscal relationship situation are. What are those questions? What are the questions to be answered with a testing, by testing fiscal impacts from those changes in land uses, and not only the uses themselves, but the patterns, the locations, the intensities, the service areas, whether utilities are available, whether they're not, infrastructure availability, those kinds of things. But again, sort of what are the choices? What are the demands? What are the pressures? What are those questions that'll help to inform land use choices in a plan, and then ultimately getting to the point where decisions and choices are made, and ensuring that it's fiscally sustainable. Those choices haven't made it unfiscally sustainable.
Yeah, I mean, the way to think about it is, if you've evaluated your land use plan and you found it to be fiscally sustainable, why do you need to evaluate every development proposal that walks through the door? If you're sticking to the plan and approving developments that are consistent with the plan, who cares if one project doesn't add up? In total, they're all going to add up. And so, and every community has contributors, every community has recipients. It's just the way it is relative to your revenue structure. And so I would contend, if more communities were doing this, you wouldn't have to require fiscal analysis of everything that walked through the door, because you would know overall you got the balance right.
Okay, this is an interesting question here. These are all interesting, but this one's real good. So when you're doing your fiscal analysis, do you take into account in some way the sensitivity of the analysis? So perhaps changing your assumptions slightly would drastically change the results. So do you have any recommendations on how to handle that, or any caveats about that?
Well, I mean, Julie may have some thoughts as well.
I do.
But from my perspective, there's usually one or two drivers of why the analysis is either positive or negative. And you sort of focus on those. Tweaking little assumptions typically doesn't move the needle that much. The caveat is, what can move the needle is the assumptions relative to the inputs associated with the land use types. Like, for instance, the sales per square footage, or excuse me, sales per square foot, or the assessed value, or the pupil generation rate, et cetera. But within the guts of the model, the reason it's negative is because of school cost or road cost, right? And no matter what you do anywhere else, it's really not going to move the needle that much.
Right. Yeah, and we, as part of most process, most studies, analyses, that those items do come up, but it really does boil down to, again, if you make minor changes on the big costs that might have an impact, or on the revenue side, but other slight variations or sensitivity analyses on the other things may not. But that's not to say that that's not an important thing to test, to hedge off those questions or those concerns, particularly from external stakeholders, community members, elected officials, to sort of disabuse the preconceived or the misconceptions about the way some land uses perform from a fiscal perspective. So we have been engaged to do that on a number of occasions, to do just that, to say, well, what if you change this factor slightly? Does it really have an effect? And if if it's no, then you can sort of move on to the next discussion.
The other thing to keep in mind here is that even on these projects or scenarios where you see either a surplus or a deficit, what we like to do is put things in perspective. And most cases, even if it's a surplus or a deficit, when you look at what that average annual result is relative to the city or county or town's overall budget, it's usually, 1, 2, 3%. So it's not like it's something that's going to bankrupt you, or conversely have a huge cash, tumbling in of revenue that allows you to elevate certain levels of service. So you got to put things in perspective.
Okay, we will finish up with one last question. Our viewers want to know, what's your going rate to do one of these analyses? They're ready.
It really depends. Depends on how big the community is, how sophisticated the budget is, how many funds, et cetera. I mean, we do these anywhere from $30,000 to $250,000. So that's a very difficult question to answer.
But we're happy to engage in further discussions.
But I mean, it's difficult.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we'll go ahead and close up shop here. So thanks to both of you for joining us today.
Yeah.
And thanks to the Virginia chapter for putting this together and hosting today's session. We really appreciate it. A PDF copy of this presentation is now up on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And we'll be getting a recording of the session up on our YouTube channel shortly. You just head over to YouTube and in the search box, just type Planning Webcast and we'll pop up. So Julie and Carson, again, thank you for joining us today. And thank you, Virginia chapter of APA, for hosting. And everyone, we will talk next time. Have a great weekend.
Thanks everybody for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.